time to wake up. It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up. It's time to wake up.
Hello, everybody. I'm
Good
Katharina
morning.
from Bronswijk. I'm a psychologist. You might be questioning why a psychologist would be joining a panel like this, but I dedicate much of my work to climate psychology, answering questions like, how can we explain the gap between intentions and actions? How does climate change affect mental health? Or how do we communicate the climate crisis in a way that sparks action? And that actually is the topic of our talk today. We're going to focus on the question how journalism can support solving the climate crisis and how we balance the urgency to act with the very human need for hope in times of crisis. And I'm honored to have Stephen Dunbar-Johnson here, who is the President International of New York Times, overseeing the international business at New York Times. And his task is to mastermind new business models to keep up the high-quality journalism at New York Times. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Stephen, you told me that about 15 to 20 years ago, you were on a conference with oil companies, and that the conversations there kind of sparked a dissonance in you because they didn't match up with the science that you were reading about climate change in your everyday work as a journalist, and that created your interest in the role of journalism in the polycrisis. And that leads me to my first question, because in Germany sometimes journalists shy away from climate reporting because they are afraid that they might be labeled as climate activists. How do you see the role of journalism in times of climate crisis?
Thank you. I'm very surprised that journalists would shy away from covering climate because they think that it's activism. I mean, I think journalism is about getting to the truth, and it is a scientific fact that climate change is happening. So I don't think there should be a debate about that, and therefore journalists should be tackling it with great vigor. It is, it is the biggest story facing humanity, the climate crisis. Therefore, I believe all news organizations should be taking it very seriously. That doesn't mean there isn't a debate around climate, but the debate is around how do we scale solutions for climate. And there you can have lots of different views. But there shouldn't really be a debate about, I'm not going to cover climate change because I'm going to be seen as an activist. I don't really understand why anyone would do that.
Yes, I totally agree with that. I mean, you already said that it is a very complex topic, talking about the causes of climate change and the other planetary boundaries that are being crossed, talking about the solutions that we need. It's a highly complex topic, and then it has to be transported in a way that is tangible for people. And then again, with populist condensed statements, there can be a contribution to polarization of debates. So my question is, how do you convey the complexity of the topic, the climate change, and the solutions needed without overwhelming readers with the vast amount of perspectives on the topic?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real challenge. We at the New York Times, back in, I think it was 2016, we put a climate desk in the heart of our newsroom. And that was, in a sense, affirmative action for climate. That team now is over 20 strong of journalists who are 100% dedicated to climate change, or covering the climate story. But that's just the tip of the spear. We have increasingly our graphics team are working on those stories, our visual investigations team, and every desk, the business. Climate is every story. It's a business story, it's a tech story, it's a health story, it covers everything. So our output is really significant. It's over 4,300 pieces, I think, last year on climate alone at the New York Times. But to your question, it is complex because what tends to get on the homepage or the front page is the dystopian nature of the climate crisis, the latest science, the latest collapsing glacier or wildfire. And it's a little bit more difficult to get people to focus on the solutions aspect. It's something we're thinking very hard about. How do you walk the line between the urgency of the challenge of climate change and focusing on the solutions. And I think journalists need to get a little bit better at trying to paint a picture of what does this all mean? If we go into the street and say, interview someone and say, well, what do you think about getting to net zero by 2050? I mean, that's such an abstract thing. So let's talk about what do our cities need to look like to be net zero by 2050? And then you begin to build a picture of cleaner, quieter, more communities, better air. And in the process of getting to that place, there's a lot of innovation. It's an optimistic story. And so much of the journalism tends to be about what we need to stop doing as opposed to what we need to start doing. And finding that balance, I think, is a challenge. But using graphics, using visual journalism in compelling ways on the platforms that people reach that journalism, mobile platforms, is, I think, also a very interesting journalistic opportunity. So I'm not sure I directly got to your question, but I think the complexity is best explained by doing good journalism across the whole panoply and using graphics and visuals in a way that brings stories to light and brings them alive for people.
Yes, thank you. You said that it's mostly the apocalyptic news that make the front page, and I think that very much goes in line with our very negative bias, the way our human brain is wired. But then again, we find in studies that in times of permanent crisis, when people hear all these bad news all the time, they tend to experience a kind of numbness around these news at some point. We call it apocalypse fatigue. And then they tend to withdraw from consuming news altogether. How do you deal with that at the New York Times?
Yeah, I mean, news fatigue is a fact, and we could say that it's burying your head in the sand at times where it's all overwhelming, and that's seen as a negative connotation. Actually, maybe that burying your head in the sand from time to time might be a good thing to do. So how we deal with it at the New York Times is we have a strategy which has the news site at its center. It's like the sun in a constellation, and around it we have other content solutions. We have our games site, which is very popular, crossword, Wordle, and other things. So people who want to engage in that, they can when they're fed up with the news. We have our cooking site, which is has well north of 1 million subscribers now. And we also have a business called The Athletic, which is a sports website. So in the middle you have the news, the beating heart, and around it you have this constellation of other things, other obsessions, food, games, mental games, and also sports. So you can be distracted and float around the ecosystem and perhaps avoid news, but it is there always. So having that, what we call bundle strategy, is quite an effective way, not just of growing our subscriptions, and we have well over 10 million subscriptions now. It's a way of retaining as well. So when people get tired, they can go off and do other things, but stay within our ecosystem.
Right. I think that we agree that in times of global crisis, we all need to play our part in creating the solutions needed. And I think that, as you said, communicating these solutions and the progress that we already achieved is very important for that. And then again, we find that creating false hopes can lead to passivity. If people feel like, yeah, well, someone else is going to do the job, it's not my part to do anything anymore. How can you communicate solutions, making sure that people don't just retreat back into their shell and think like it's their job, somebody else is doing it? Yeah,
I mean, I think, again, human stories, the job in journalism and getting to how do you build this, make this thing alive for people, is about human stories. And in there is inspiring people to be the change. We spoke a little bit yesterday about Ubuntu and the South African philosophy, or Zulu philosophy, which is about how you can participate every day. How can you act as an individual? And I think it's the same with climate. It's not just what can you do as an individual, can you do as part of a community, what can you do in your job. And I think in journalism, ways of how allowing people to, giving people clues of how they can get engaged in this, in big ways, small ways, is quite important. going back to what I was saying about the marriage of the science and the urgency with giving hope. We're going to be launching later on this year a climate solutions space within our news content, which will allow people to go who are looking for concrete solutions to climate change. This, I hope, will be a sort of repository of that information, but it will all be based on human stories. I was very inspired personally by something I saw as an example of how to do good journalism in this space. It was not by us, in fact, but by Channel 4 News in the UK, which is a news channel. And they had a segment which I just fell upon, which was on rewilding in parts of northern England and in Scotland. Essentially, the story was a climate story. It was about rewilding as a carbon sink, but that's not how they approached the story. They approached the story by explaining that jobs had increased by 70% in these two parts of the country, in Scotland and in northwest England, because the communities had been revived. Young people were going back. One of the pubs that had closed is reopened. So it was about opportunity, and it was about jobs, and it was about people, and about community. And then it was about a climate. It was about, oh, by the way, this is what's happening this is the advantage to the climate, this is how much CO2 these pieces of land are going to be absorbing now. But it was coming from a human angle, and it was a terrific story. And I think it was an example of the sort of things that we should be doing in journalism.
Yes, that's really beautiful, because what we found in studies in psychological research around apocalypse fatigue and climate anxiety is that what helps people cope with these big crises is the experience of collective efficacy. So finding out how I can contribute to solutions working together with others. I don't know if that's the feedback that you probably get to these articles that you publish. Yes. Thank you very much for this amazing insight. We are reaching the end of our time. Thank you, Stephen.
I'm very happy. Thank you.
Stephen Dunbar-Johnson on balancing hope and urgency in climate journalism.
Thank you.
It's time to wake up.